I have pressed the button for recording, but I don't see that anything has happened.
We got it, Kara.
Oh,
Yep,
good. Great.
you're recording. Yep.
Wonderful. Okay, so welcome to everyone. So first off, there's first a task for you all. If everyone could put their name and their organization in the chat for attendance purposes, we would really appreciate that. Saves us some figuring it out later. We will be posting our PowerPoint deck on our Office of Recovery website, which is also where the grant application is posted. So we'll make sure to get that done. And we'll do that within 5 business days. As we mentioned, this session is being recorded, already pressed the button. And then we will post the recording and Q&A within 5 business days. We are welcome to take questions during the presentation. If that is the case and you would like to ask a question, we ask that you raise your hand using the raise hand feature, and whoever is presenting at the time will try to call on you. You can use the chat for questions, but I will say it is much easier for us to see the raised hand feature, particularly for me who's presenting, than to see the chat, but we will do our best to catch questions in the chat. Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about the funding source that we have. And so we'll do that. We'll talk about the timeline, what the grant can fund, highlights of both eligibility and who qualifies to apply, along with rating criteria. And then we'll have a variety of items that we talk about with regards to the application, our application checklist, along with any questions about the application, time for additional Q&A at the end, assuming that we don't use all the Q&A time during the presentation.
Kara, we lost you there for a moment.
Froze. Where did I freeze? Great. Am I
Just
back?
you go ahead and start at the beginning. Yeah.
Okay. So agenda for today, we'll talk about background and guidelines. We'll talk about our funding source, which is through ARPA, our timeline, what the grant funds, highlights and eligible activities, along with who can apply and our rating criteria. That'll be between Eric, Kit, and I. And then we'll talk about the applications. And if we don't use all of our time for Q&A during the presentation, we will go ahead and have some Q&A time at the end. So for background, so my Office of Recovery and Resilience, was developed in the summer of 2021. And our prime responsibility is to help Snohomish County recover from the pandemic and become more resilient, and chiefly, administer $160 million of American Rescue Plan Act that was allocated to the county. That's the funding that has been provided for this grant. This funding is one time. I will say the timeline is very short. Construction projects must be fully permitted and contracted by September 2024 and completed by October of 2026. Planning projects are the same timeline. So timeline for this actual grant application. So we announced the application on December 13th. We're having the info session today, January 5th. Application deadline is January 27th at 4 p.m. We will then review as a committee the applications. We plan our award notification in Q1. So by March 31st, and we'll then start contract negotiations. So I am going to turn it over to, I believe, Eric to talk about the next couple of slides.
Okay, thank you, Carol. So what does the grant application fund? It funds projects in 2 buckets. The first bucket are capital construction projects that are ready to go, that they're permitted and designed and ready to go to meet criteria. We can talk more about that. And these projects are intended to mitigate the risk of river and coastal flooding in our special purpose districts. And then the planning and design projects essentially is all the work that runs up to a capital project. So projects that prepare for future flood risk reduction in the county. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that, I think, on the next slide. But before we get to that, so the capital construction projects. The total amount in this grant program is, as you're aware, is $2 million, and we have not decided how much is going to be capital and how much will be planning, because we don't know what we will receive. But the minimum project for a capital project is $250,000, and the request can be up to the full amount. On the planning side, the minimum amount for a planning grant application is $100,000. It is an open and competitive funding process. And as you can imagine, the project sites have to be located within the bounds of Snohomish County. Next slide. So just a brief example of some of the projects. This is not exhaustive. On the capital side, dike improvements, repairs, and/or maintenance projects are sort of the obvious and most necessary capital project for a special flood control district or drainage or diking district. Could also be a setback dike that is stipulated for in the same geographic area, or in terms of tide gates and pump stations, either the repair, replacement, or upgrades to that type of infrastructure within a district. On the planning side, the run-up for these projects, the design and planning of a setback dike, or planning for climate change and sea level rise considerations. The last king tide last week, I think, was a reminder that things are changing, and some dikes that might meet yesterday's elevations are quickly not going to be meeting future elevation needs due to sea level rise. So planning for that is something that we're hearing from districts as an important area of their future work. And a third bucket might just be an infrastructure need assessment in a district. So those are just some of the examples for funding consideration. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but one of the important points to make is that the funding source is limited to one of the special purpose districts in the county or a city in partnership with one of those districts. The application provided a link to the maps of the special purpose districts in the county. And I don't need to go through the rest. I would put all of you to sleep. So next slide. And additional eligibility requirements in particular for the capital projects. There's a timing project. The project really has to be almost shovel ready. It needs to be mostly permitted and designed just to be able to meet the deadlines that Kara just spoke to. There are some other elements of in terms of eligibility, such as the prevailing wage and capital related. Primarily the capital wage, and there are some other requirements that are in the application. And then the next slide. So for additional, as I mentioned, the project is to be located in the county. The application does have additional requirements for eligible activities. Let's see, last. So for capital projects, activities include the construction, renovation or rehabilitation of flood control structures. Soft costs can include project costs that are not directly construction, but can include management and permitting costs. And for planning projects, the cost related directly to the development of an eligible flood risk reduction project. So I will move on to, I believe, to Kit.
Yes, thank you, Eric. So as far as funding priorities go, some of these apply to both types of projects. The column on the right, the column on the left is just for capital projects. So funding priorities, again, these aren't requirements. They're what you will do, but you will score better if you meet some or all of these criteria. And what you don't meet in one set of them, you can meet in other ways. So again, think of these as desirable priorities to have. If you don't, they don't apply, they don't apply. So the first one is using FEMA's HAZA software to determine that you meet the criteria of high risk based on that software and those parameters. Capital projects that have completed an environmental review and secured all necessary permits. So more ready to go projects. Capital projects that reduce the risk to critical facilities like medical facilities, care facilities, police stations, etc. Not limited to those, but critical facility risk reduction. Capital projects that reduce the risk to critical transportation networks, including rail lines, highways, and county roads. And projects that reduce the risk of high economic loss from a flood. So for both capital and planning projects, you're showing a demonstrated ability to manage federal funding grants. You would score higher if you can do that effectively. Demonstrate that. You successful applicants will provide evidence they can complete the project within the tight funding window of the ARPA money. And the projects located in or will reduce flood risk to a qualifying census tract. There aren't a ton of those in the county, but there are some related to some of your dikes that will also, because of the source of the funding, the ARPA funding, its relationship to COVID, that is an important parameter that we will take into account. So next slide, please. So this is the first grouping of scores. So this is the project elements, outputs, and benefits, kind of, you know, what is the significance of your project? And it shows you the weighting. So the first two questions, the comments or the criteria, I guess, criteria are worth, 15 points by themselves. So just taking note of that you need to have clear objectives and actions in your proposal, that we know what we're funding and it's consistent with the parameters, both of eligibility, and makes it clear to us what priority actions you're addressing. And then flood risk that's addressed is significant or potentially significant, and potential for significant failure of levee infrastructure that would affect properties that it's protecting, and so on and so on. And then there's numerous other criteria, but as you can see, again, I read those two on purpose because those are the two highest scoring criteria. So this is the first group. So your first 30 points come from this. The next grouping is, I'll see the next slide to remind myself what it is. Okay, implementation and scope of work. So this is pretty straightforward. Description of tasks, deliverables, so exactly what you're producing as the end product of particular elements of your proposal. The timeline accounts for the funding constraints. We talked about the ultimate timeline of being fully contracted by September 2024 and a completed project by October 2026. And then these last two just apply to capital projects and not planning projects. So that's why that's grayed out, because there are no permits for an assessment. So your permits and authorizations, and you're able to get them, or you're well on your way to getting them that shows us you can meet that timeline. And then again, this is where the 5 points come in for the HAZAS evaluation if you have done that. So now you can see kind of what the benefit of that is. So the next one is your project team. So your project team is competent and experienced. So what other big projects have you taken on like this that you can kind of make that case? Project team, again, manage federal funding, including all the unique federal reporting requirements that go with that, project documentation, and budget management of a federal budget. And then the budget itself is cost effective and consistent for the scope. What you're proposing taking money for is consistent with the actions that are the purpose of this grant. And budget breakdown is detailed, and the documentation is thorough enough to really see what money is going where and what is being achieved with the money if you were awarded it. So next, then we have readiness to proceed. Obviously, with the short timeline, this is a big deal as well. You have the necessary capacity in place to really hit the ground running the moment you are given funding. for both types of projects. And then for projects in a construct that you within the grant permits are basically close to completion. So you're showing readiness. If it's not perfect readiness, you're making it really clear how close to ready you actually are. So then the next set, you'll get an application checklist, which shows that you have completed application form, the threshold criteria form, and the evaluation criteria questions, including a completed scope of work and completed budget table. So next slide. To be considered complete, all applications must include the following attachments: vicinity and site maps, if the project is site specific, less so for a generalized planning grant. The IDP documentation and proof of tribal consultation. For capital and planning projects, you need a cover letter signed by the person authorized to enter into the legal agreement with the county for this funding. And if a city is applying on behalf of a special purpose district, the letter is signed by a person from the flood special district or the drainage or diking district that is actually authorizing the city to do that on their behalf. So next. So I think this is my last slide, how you submit your application. So applications are received no later than 4 p.m. Friday, January 27th of this month, or earlier if you can, to demonstrate the application was submitted by the grant application deadline. That email stamp will be our proof that you actually have turned it in within this time frame. And we're not able to review applications after that point because of our timeline. And applications and all additional documentation is emailed to the same email you've been using with any questions you've sent, surfacewater@snoco.org, by the deadline. Here's the important note to make sure because we're going to get a ton of these, put flood risk reduction grant application and this particular district. So if you were the Stille Flood Control District, you would put that DD13. It sounds like you folks are here as well, DD7. You just make sure we know who it is. So. And I think that's it for my slide. And now we're going to go back to Kara to tell us what happens after submissions.
Awesome, thanks. So we will have so first we'll do an eligibility review. SWIM review committee will complete review of applications and scoring. Our team in the Office of Recovery and Resilience will receive a copy of project materials, and evaluation criteria for each project to make sure compliance with the funding source. Funding recommendations will be sent to the Snohomish County Council for approval, and then County Council will make those final awards. So we will have a step where we need to go through County Council. And kind of some basic stuff. Please follow the required format. I know it sounds silly, but please do this. It will save us all some gray hairs. Do be specific. Don't assume just because maybe you've done other projects with the kind folks that are maybe on this call or you've worked with in SWIM that they know you and already know your abilities. Please make sure to spell it out in the application. Make sure to use the scoring criteria. So keep that scoring criteria in mind. Do double check your budget numbers, and do note that the budget template does have strict thresholds with regards to amount of percentages of the amount that can be used for certain types of expenses. Always a good idea to have someone review your application, make sure you have all the pieces and parts. Do start early, and please make sure that we get your materials well before that 4 p.m. deadline. We do have to be very strict and stringent on all of these requirements because we do expect to have someone looking over our shoulder in the future with regards to this funding source. And then make sure to submit all the required attachments with all of those signatures from the officials that are needed. Finally, if you have questions, so you have the surface water email, but you can also ask questions to our general county recovery email address that is shown right here. And then we will be posting a Q&A. We will be adding to that Q&A if there are additional questions, and then only written answers are considered official responses. So always keep that in mind. And I think that's it. I am going to stop sharing. Does anyone have any additional questions? Seems like a very quiet group.
That was pretty comprehensive. You guys did a good job summarizing what we need to do.
Fabulous, thanks.
I don't know if you're the person to ask, but I just have a couple of general questions. How many projects are you expecting to be awarded? And then can one entity or one group apply for more than one project?
Great questions. We don't have an expectation with regards to the number of projects, but we do have a total amount of funding of $2 million. So we do expect more than one project. But I don't think we've capped the number of projects, particularly because since there's the capital projects and the planning projects, we imagine that we will have large projects and small projects. So it will be hard to tell the difference, or hard to predict that. There we go.
So Snohomish County is only awarded $2 million for total, or is that the size of each project?
$2 million total for this grant program.
Oh,
so there could be a lot of applicants for that $2 million.
right.
And then I think your second question was, can you apply for more than one?
Correct.
I see no reason why you could not.
Okay.
Great. Who will manage the grant agreements? I don't think we've fully decided who will fully manage the grant agreements in Snohomish County. So that is to be determined. Other questions? Okay, I feel like I've waited the requisite amount of time to find out if there's other questions. Though I will say, last call for questions if anyone has anything. Wonderful. Then I think we are all set. And we're going to get 34 minutes of our lives back, which sounds amazing.
All right.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for attending.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Reach out if you have additional questions later. Thanks, folks.
All right. Thank you. Bye.